So this lecture will be discussing American society in the 1920s. This time period in general is associated with Prohibition, which is why you see the bottles on the corner. It's also associated with flappers, increasing rights for women. Women get the right to vote. It is associated with conservative values, a return to normalcy, a return to isolationism, and kind of the era before the Great Depression. So just some of the political philosophies you'll need to be familiar with to really understand this time period would be radicals, conservatives, reactionaries, and liberals. Radicals in the 1920s generally refer to those who are socialists, communists, or anarchists. They are typically immigrants, but not exclusively. They want a violent revolution. They want a drastic change in society and government. Conservatives are basically the exact opposite of radicals. They want everything to stay the same. They want to preserve the existing order. And oftentimes they are pro-business, laissez-faire capitalism, hands-off business. Most of the politicians during this time period, especially Republicans, are conservative. So you'll see a lot of conservative policies being passed. Next, we have reactionaries. Reactionaries wanted to move society back into the past. Usually it's an idealized past. Oftentimes, these were mugwumps, who, if you remember from the previous lecture, were those who were part of the Republican Party but left it to join the Democratic Party. And progressive WAS, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Lastly, you have liberals. Liberals advocated for change in society's institutions in order to reflect changing conditions. Usually, these are your progressive era reformers. Very reform-minded, but also conservative. They do not want violent, radical changes, but they do want some type of change. Keep in mind, while you think about these terms, that they are also an ends as well as a means. So, for example, the socialist presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs ran for his political office in a democratic political system. So he was a radical pursuing his radical agenda within a conservative system. Americanism during this time period basically refers to the Red Scare, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a return to things that are American, a focus on being patriotic, and a rejection of anything that is not considered American, so anything that is Russian, Italian, usually because of new immigration, Eastern or Southern European. This also includes an increasing fear of communism or any radical approach. This was a response to the Bolshevik or the October Revolution of 1917, and this fear of communism, fear of radicalism, combined with increasing inflation and increasing economic woes, not only in the United States but around the world, will lead to the Red Scare, it will lead to labor strikes, and it will lead to several bad decisions, shall we say, by our government. So one of the first of these strikes was the Seattle General Strike, and this strike specifically involved about 35,000 shipyard workers. Eventually, these shipyard workers will be joined by all of the labor unions in Seattle for an additional 60,000 workers who go on strike demanding a wage increase. The inflation that had been allowed to happen as a result of World War I meant that the cost of living was increasing. Rent was raising. Utility prices were raising. The cost of food had gone up. All of this meant that it cost more to survive, but wages had stagnated. These workers go on a peaceful strike. It's not like the Gilded Age strikes we had talked about before. There are not federal or state troops brought in. Really, the importance of this strike is that it brings up a political debate within labor unions of the time, this idea of industrial democracy. Industrial democracy, in simplified terms, just means kind of a socialist collective ownership of public utilities or public services, in this case railroads. These railroads under this philosophy would have been owned by the federal government under a board of directors, and this board of directors would have been representing consumers and labor. Under this board, they would set policies, they would determine how the workers would work, what they would do, and then it would be the workers' responsibility, based off of the guidelines of this board, to run that utility or run that service. Then all of the profits made by those workers would be collectively divided among them. Unfortunately for labor efforts at the time, this is going to be turned down. It's vetoed in Congress in August of 1919. But the Seattle strike is not the only strike during this time period. Another far-reaching strike was the Boston police strike. This strike is exactly what it sounds like. A group of policemen go on strike. They are specifically asking for a wage increase. In total, about 70% of Boston's police force go on strike, and that is about 15,000 policemen. They wanted not only a wage increase, but also the right to unionize. They had been working extremely long hours, in some cases 70 to 90 hours a week, without overpay time and without pay for certain duties like parade duty. In many cases, this is a return to Gilded Age policies. The strike grows out of hand. It comes to include 37 other cities, and in response to this growth, Governor Calvin Coolidge calls in the National Guard to put down this police strike. Calvin Coolidge will become president later. He uses the idea of protecting the public good in order to support using the National Guard against the police force. Ultimately, the result of this strike is that those striking policemen are fired and replaced, many of them, with National Guardsmen. The steel strike in September of 1919 is another strike very similar to the police strike. The American Federation of Labor attempted to organize the steel industry, but now they have a major shift. So previously, the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, was very exclusive. It did not allow in unskilled labor. And now, after World War I, with increasing membership and increasing calls for change, they're trying to organize unskilled labor by industry, in this case, the steel industry. They tell and help organize a strike for the USX Steel Corporation, seeking an 8-hour workday, a 6-day work week, and an end to the 24 shift. The then head of the U.S. Steel Corporation, Albert H. Gary, refused to negotiate with the AFL and this strike. The grounds for that refusal was that he was not actually a worker. The AFL union was not actually working for his company. Nearly half of the nation's steel workers worked for USX Steel at the time and go on strike. This is a very violent strike, and ultimately it leads to, again, calling in federal and state troops in order to break it up. It takes a really long time to break up the strike. It starts in September of 1919. It's not officially ended until January of 1920. This strike and its failure marks a hardening of Americans on labor matters moving forwards. One of the last strikes I wanted to talk about was the United Mine Workers of America strike. This strike is led by John L. Lewis, who is perhaps the most important labor leader of the 20th century, along with Samuel Gompers. The importance of this strike is that it is going to involve Attorney General Palmer, who we will talk about in a second, and that it is a return, again, to Gilded Age policies to end strikes, specifically the use of injunctions or jailing anyone who has chosen to strike. President Wilson at the time will use World War I legislation that had prohibited strikes in wartime industries, which this would be one, to end the strike. Alright, so the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids get their name from Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who we had talked about with the previous slide. He was in charge, given about $500,000 from Congress, to address a series of bombings that had been happening throughout major places in the United States, the most famous of which was one in Wall Street. Unfortunately, we will never actually find who is responsible for these bombings. General Palmer will end up arresting and deporting many communist, quote unquote, communist radicals, many of them Russian. But again, the actual terrorists responsible for these bombs are never found. Palmer says that he is there to protect the country. He is overreaching some civil liberties. He's infringing on many rights that Americans have. But he is saying that this is necessary, that we need to do this in order to protect against this radical seed. And many Americans at the time period agree with him. He warns America that the May Day strikes, that there will be an coming series of massive bombings, a massive attack on the United States, and he needs this money and this support to try and stop that from happening. In total, during his raids, with the support of Miss Wilson, about 5,000 suspected communists will be arrested. In total, the majority of them, again, are Russian. 550 of them will be deported. Many of these were U.S. citizens. Many did not speak Russian. They were not familiar with Russia. Some hadn't even set foot in Russia, but they are kind of deported without a second thought for the protection of the country. Ultimately, these raids will come to an end when those supposed May Day strikes don't happen. General Palmer had said that these strikes would happen in the summer of 1920. When that doesn't occur, the general public support of this kind of peters out. I've linked a video here to YouTube that discusses these raids in more detail. Please copy and paste it. It's only about 4 minutes long. Another instance of increasing infringement on civil liberties in response to radical fear was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. So, as those last names suggest, these are two Italian immigrants. They are going to be charged and convicted of killing two people in a robbery in 1921. Really, this trial is kind of a debauched trial. There's really no conclusive evidence. There is an extremely prejudiced jury and judge who will eventually convict these men on the basis that they are Italian, that they are draft dodgers from World War I, and that they are anarchists. And the fact that they are both going to be convicted and sentenced to death by the electric chair draws worldwide attention. There are riots in the streets in much of Europe and Japan because of this court case and this failure of justice. Ultimately, these men will be vindicated, but it's not until the 1970s that we review this case and say, yes, there were faults with this trial. Another kind of negative impact of a return to isolationism and hyper-patriotism is the Ku Klux Klan. So there is a massive resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Again, a lot of this is reactionary, but this resurgence starts in the South, it spreads very quickly through the North, it gets millions of members. It is kind of spurred on by one of the first full-length feature films, Birth of a Nation. President Wilson will actually show Birth of a Nation in the White House. This movie is black and white. It does not have sound, so it has those captions at the bottom. It's pretty long. It's about 3 hours long. And it is basically glorifying the KKK and justifying a system of slavery. It's extremely racist film, and it is very pro-WASP, or pro-white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. In general, the Ku Klux Klan during this time, they of course are anti-immigrant and anti-African American, but they also are heavily against birth control, heavily against communism, any type of radical view. The decline of the KKK will be due to this man, David Stevenson. He is a high-ranking Klan member in Indiana. He is also a well-known politician in Indiana. He will be tried and convicted of kidnapping, abusing, and murdering a white woman. His response to these charges is, quote, "I am the law in Indiana." This blatant disregard for protecting women, which was a sacred value of the KKK, and not only women, but a white middle-class woman, was an outrage to the American public. And The fact that he was a high-ranking politician and Klan member meant that he had a lot of evidence that he could use to kind of leverage his case. And after he's convicted, he will use those kind of dirty secrets against the entire KKK as an organization, which will eventually lead to embezzlement charges brought up against the entire organization by Congress. So another part of this return to normalcy or return to isolationism was nativism and a fear of immigration. Goes along with the rise of the KKK. This fear led to a wave of anti-immigration laws. Some of the most restrictive anti-immigration laws we've had in this country. The first of these laws was the 1921 Immigration Act, which basically ended open immigration into the United States. It set up a limit and quota system where only about 350,000 total immigrants were allowed in, and of those immigrants, no more than 3% of the people allowed into the United States could be immigrants. The basis of this number was the 1910 census. The majority of immigrants who are coming in during this act are from Northern and Western European countries. So this act apparently wasn't strong enough, and eventually, not long after it, we passed the National Origins Act of 1924. Sometimes you'll hear this called the Immigration Act of 1924. They mean the same thing. What this act does is it actually further restricts this quota. It cuts the quota from 350,000 all the way down to about 150,000, and it cuts that 3% down to 2%, and it entirely bans anyone who is of Asian descent. Those who are excluded from this act are Canadians and Latin Americans. They were seen as more American. And in general, Irish and Germans are not really affected by this act. It's specifically trying to target Eastern and Southern Europeans and Asian Americans. Eventually, by 1931, more foreigners are leaving the country than coming into the country, and this will be the policy of our country until the 1960s. So another kind of debate in this time period was over religion. Darwin and his infamous evolution theories, survival of the fittest, had been used in the Gilded Age extensively to defend wealth and defend the wealthy. And now it will be kind of attacked by many schools in the South. The Scopes trial, the John Scopes trial, sometimes you'll hear it called the monkey trial, takes place in 1925 in Dayton, Tennessee, and it was a specific reaction to the Butler Law of 1924. John Scopes, who was a biology teacher in Tennessee at the time, willfully violates this law, which basically said that as a teacher, you are not allowed to teach evolution. You are only allowed to teach divine creation. He is asked by the American Civil Liberties Union to address and break this law willfully. It is the American Civil Liberties Union lawyer, Clarence Darrow, who will defend him in this trial case. The prosecutor in this case will be William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was a Presbyterian fundamentalist. If you remember him from the populist movement, he is put on trial himself. And unfortunately, when he is asked very poignant questions about his interpretation of the Bible, there are some striking inconsistencies. So much so that the stress from this trial actually leads him to die from a stroke less than a week after the trial has ended. Ultimately, John Scopes will be found guilty of violating the Butler Act, which he did do. But the fine or the consequence for doing so is very minimal. He's charged a $100 fine, but eventually this fine is kind of waived by the Supreme Court of Tennessee, and ultimately he just kind of goes back to what he was doing. It really doesn't solve anything. It doesn't solve the debate on either side. So Prohibition is iconic to the 1920s. We've talked about it a lot in other lectures, so I won't kind of beat it over the head here, But you do need to know the 18th Amendment, which was ratified in 1919, officially starts the Prohibition experiment. The Volstead Act of 1919 is basically the enforcement arm of the 18th Amendment. Prohibition only lasts 14 years before it's repealed, and the most important thing that Prohibition creates is crime. The most infamous rise of crime, Al Capone, John Dillinger, underground crime and criminal activities comes to outweigh the entire profit of the country at the time period. So Al Capone. Al Capone is very iconic. I've linked a video here that I would like you to kind of copy and paste to make sure that you have a chance to watch about him and his life. He is probably one of the most famous or infamous, if you want to look at it that way, gangsters of the 1920s. His bootlegging business lasted about 6 years and was run out of Chicago. And ultimately, his downfall will be tax evasion. He will die in prison because of taxes. And taxes at the time was a fairly new concept. So if you remember from the Progressive era, the creation of federal and state income tax was not that old, and it was a new concept that many did not yet understand. And so another very famous gangster of the 1920s was John Dillinger, who's shown here. Sometimes you'll see him with Babyface Nelson. He is going to be hunted down by the FBI, and this video is some stock footage of that. It is footage from the time period discussing his capture. I put up some statistics on this side, so by 1930, just to put into perspective the level of this crime, the underworld had taken in more than the entire revenue of the federal government, $12 to $18 billion. This is also the time period of mass consumption. We kind of spent time perfecting production during World War I. We were extremely good at making things efficiently and quickly by this point, and now we needed to sell it. And in order to sell it, we tended to glorify business. We tended to focus on conservative, pro-business, laissez-faire approaches. And one of the most famous lines, Calvin Coolidge, a conservative president, the man who builds a factory builds a temple. Business was so revered that in books like The Man Nobody Knows by Bruce Barton, a businessman was equated to Jesus, how Jesus goes and collects 12 disciples and he trains these 12 disciples in his image. It was almost a religion at this time period. So our economy, after World War I, we are the biggest creditor nation, but there is a brief depression. We did have runaway inflation to some degree, and we had to shift our economy after the war from a war-based economy to a consumer-based economy, and that took some time. So there was a brief, fairly sharp depression. We were not alone in that depression, though. It was kind of a worldwide depression, nothing on the scale of the 1930s that we'll be talking about next week. The response to this economic woe by conservatives, specifically Andrew Mellon, was the idea of trickle-down tax policies, or the idea that cutting taxes on the wealthy would lead to increased wages for the middle and working classes. Unfortunately, this is not the case. What ultimately ends up happening as a result of these trickle-down policies was that the middle class had a larger tax burden and not the reciprocating wage increases. Some good things that do come out of this increasing economic production was an increase in electric power. So previously to the war, fewer homes had electric. Now in cities it's increased 19-fold. New technologies like radio keeps us more connected. The rise of cars during this time period, the Model T, the airplane, all of these inventions are going to give us more leisure time, get us more connected. But we still have kind of a guild on our economy, and that guild, or that kind of mirror, will eventually be broken when we get to the 30s. This is also the rise of white-collar workers. So This is actually a result of the decline of manufacturing jobs, the first decline in manufacturing jobs we had seen since the Industrial Revolution. White-collar workers were those often in advertising who were in offices, typists for women, managers for men. They often were college educated, middle class. They tended to be well off, much better paid than your average factory worker, and they were typically, at least at this time period, fairly well respected. The good thing about this rise in white collar workers is that it does get women into the workforce. The type machine, the fact that women have the right to vote, they're increasingly encouraged to be their own individuals, and that they had already entered the workforce because of World War I. Many of them stayed, and many of the middle class women moved into these white collar jobs. The majority of women in the workforce, though, will still be in those domestic service roles. Women who are immigrants or African Americans generally could not get jobs as typists. This is the era before spell check, unfortunately, and in order to be a typist, you had to know grammar and spelling. Usually that required a college education. So this increase in stuff meant that they had to have an increase in ways to sell it. They had to get more creative about how to sell it and who to sell it to and how to make it more appealing. And that led to the rise of advertising. If you've ever seen Mad Men, that is a quintessential 1920s advertising. It's typically men. Men outnumber women 10 to 1 in advertising field. Usually, again, they're young, they're white, they're male, they're college educated, and they are generally very well paid. This is the era when they start using sex appeal to sell things. Sex sells. They start using celebrities to sell things. Sports become huge, especially with the invention of the radio. And eventually, advertising is a billion-dollar industry. Kind of piggybacking off of advertising in this increase in production was something called Taylorism or scientific management. They mean the same thing. Scientific management is from the title of his book, The Principles of Scientific Management by Frederick W. Taylor. Taylor is really the guy who invents or kind of is the brainchild of the assembly line, and this will be embraced fully by the automobile industry, specifically Ford and his Model T. Basically, what scientific management says is that you need to have a regimented workforce. You need to have a system of schedules. You need to have bells. You need to have managers to oversee production. You should have workers only doing one task, very focused, very streamlined, and it worked. For Henry Ford and his assembly lines, his production increases exponentially, from going to making a car every hour and a half to a car every 14 hours to a car every hour and a half. His competition, Ramson E. Olds or Oldsmobile, now out of business, also switched to an assembly line type of manufacturing. At the time, Henry Ford's entire automobile capital was built in Detroit, Michigan. And because of his use of this assembly line and because of the way he treated his workers, he has very liberal pay for his workers. His Model T becomes very quickly the most iconic car of the time period. If an American owned a car, it more than likely was a Model T, and it more than likely was black because he really only sold it in black. Unfortunately, the rise of automobiles does have a dark side, and there is a massive increase in automobile accidents and related deaths. It's probably one of the least safe ways to travel. At the time period, 1 million Americans had died in car accidents by 1951. Just to put that into perspective, that is more Americans that have been killed in all of America's battles up until that point. So the airplane is another iconic invention of the 1920s. In December of 17th of 1903, the Wright brothers, Orville and Wilbur Wright, flew a gasoline-powered plane 12 seconds and 120 feet at Kitty Hawk Airport in North Carolina. This officially launches the age of flight. The airplane will be used to some degree in World War I, mostly for airmail and other small flights, not for bombing. It can't carry a lot of weight and nothing that is a much longer trip. The first transcontinental airmail route will be established from New York to San Francisco in 1920. During this time period, airplanes were mostly used for things like mail or for quick kind of business trips for the wealthy. They are very dangerous. They're not used for widespread public transportation at the time. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh, who is probably the golden boy of the airplane age, flew the first solo flight across the Atlantic from New York to Paris. This flight was done on a custom-built plane. He spent about $10,000 creating the Spirit of St. Louis, and it took him 39 hours and 39 minutes to make this transatlantic flight. Overall, Lindbergh will immediately become an American hero. He gets a nice nickname. He becomes New York Times Man of the Year. Just loved by the American public and the world as a whole. Some of the negative impacts of the airplane will, of course, be on the railroad industry and its associated partners, so railroad and other transportation decline. But airplanes do allow for quicker mail service. They will eventually allow for passenger planes to be used. They will allow for other industries that go into the creation of airplanes to flourish. Another new technology of the time period was radio. Radio is the iconic 1920s image. Instead of crowding around a television set like you might in the 1950s, everyone crowded around the radio and listened to all of their shows, whether it's sports or an advertisement, like the jingle for Wheaties. Radio gets its start really with an Italian, Marconi. He invented the radio in the 1890s and intended for it to be used for long-range communications, which it is used in World War I. The first voice-carrying radio came in November of 1920 when KDKA in Pittsburgh carried the news of the Harding landslide victory to the American public. Eventually, other national radio networks would be formed, one in 1926, National Broadcasting Company, and one in 1927, the Columbia Broadcasting Company. Overall, this industry will grow into a booming billion-dollar industry. Everyone owned a radio. Everyone listened to radio broadcasts, whether in the comfort of their home or out on the streets. And radio was how you got your news, it's how you got new music, it's how you learned about sports and politics. Millions of Americans tuned into shows like Amos and Andy and others. The 1920s also sees the emergence of the movie industry. Movies get their start in the 1890s with peep shows at penny arcades, which was basically a big box where you'd put a penny in. It would show you part of a flip show, and then in order to continue to watch, you had to continue to put pennies in. The first real motion picture isn't until 1903, The Great Chain Robbery. And that was shown in 5-cent theaters, then called Nickelodeon. So if you've ever wondered where that name comes from for the kids programs, that's where it's come from. This then progressed into full-length films, the most famous of which, Birth of a Nation in 1915. These were not with sound though, so these are silent films. All of the films are silent until about 1927 when talkies take off. Films get a huge boost because they're used by the Creel Committee and others as World War I propaganda tools, often against Germans, but against any Axis power in World War I. And Americans start going to the movie theater more and more. Eventually, Hollywood and the United States will become kind of a movie capital of the world. Paramount Pictures will be founded in 1914 at the start of the war by Cecil B. DeMille and will make hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 40 years. Talkies, the very first of which, The Jazz Singer, are introduced in the late 1920s. They very quickly surpassed the silent films such as Birth of a Nation from the 1915. For a more in-depth review of movies, I would encourage you to watch this YouTube clip. It is kind of long, about 8 minutes. But it shows you the progression of movies. It shows you some of these clips and some of the actors that were famous at the time, like Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. This is also a time period when working conditions in general changed. The American public started to realize that if you reduce the number of hours, if you give more benefits to your workers, they don't go on strike as often. They don't kind of stand up against your policies, and they're more willing to work. They're more productive, actually, if you give them more of the things they want. And this idea is known as welfare capitalism. Welfare capitalism works wonderfully. This reduction in hours and better wages and safer working conditions means that many Americans have a lot more leisure time. Unfortunately, they don't have a lot more money. So workers during this time period have more leisure time, but not enough money to buy a lot of the leisure goods to use that time. The 1920s is also associated with a sexual revolution, most commonly flappers, the woman who is shown here. This idea was based off of Sigmund Freud, or the interpretation that sexual repression was responsible for emotional problems. So you needed to have sexual freedom to have emotional freedom. And that concept led to a lot of new codes of dress, new dancing styles, the rise of the jazz age and the flaming youth, the use of birth control, which in many cases was illegal at this time, as well as short hair, short dresses, drinking and smoking in public, especially for women, increasing number of divorces, and women increasingly entering the workforce. This is something that primarily impacted women, but it also impacts men, and so that their relationship with women changes. Jazz is another iconic feature of the 1920s, and if you're not familiar with jazz, or if you're not familiar with Louis Armstrong or some of the other greats, I would encourage you to watch at least part of this YouTube clip. It is Louis Armstrong performing one of his most famous songs. But jazz in general gets its start all the way back in the 1890s, and it becomes extremely popular in the 20s as kind of a response to the Great Migration of the North in World War I. So jazz starts out from ragtime. It eventually grows from ragtime into blues and eventually into jazz as we know it. Jazz generally is big band music, and oftentimes it's not music that's written down. It's kind of from the soul, spur of the moment. The most iconic centers for jazz of this time period was New Orleans and Dixieland jazz, kind of a new improvisation style of music. Eventually, Chicago will become the center of jazz music moving forward. Part of this rise of jazz and this increase in response to that Great Migration is the Harlem Renaissance. So Harlem itself is a black enclave in New York City that had grown rapidly during World War I because of jobs. Those who were seeking labor went to Harlem, and this huge enclave grows there. Harlem and the Harlem Renaissance itself is referring to this wealth of African American poetry, literature, art, music that comes out of this area during this time period. It's iconic for Duke Ellington and the Cotton Club, but it is also associated with kind of more radical thinking, such as Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey is responsible for the Back to Africa movement. He founds the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA, and a lot of his ideas will eventually be used for the Nation of Islam and the Black Power movement in the 60s. His entire idea was to support separatism, or promote relocation of African Americans to Africa. And he actually creates and founds his own steamship company called the Black Star Steamship Company to send African Americans back to Africa. Eventually, this company will go under. It will mostly go under because Garvey is being pursued by the then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and he will be arrested and convicted for wire fraud associated with this steamship company. This is also the era of the so-called lost generation. I'm sure you guys have been forced, or at least told, that you should read stories by Henry L. Mencken, F. Scott Fitzgerald, or Ernest Hemingway, or Sinclair Lewis, William Faulkner. These are all writers of the 1920s who usually felt betrayed by society. Ernest Hemingway in particular was a World War I veteran fighting on the Italian front, and a lot of his stories reflect kind of that negative view. They reflect, the horrors of war and the inability of mankind to rise up and learn from past mistakes. Architecture, this is also the rise of probably the most famous architect in U.S. history, Frank Lloyd Wright. His architecture is shown below. He is in direct opposition to the general thrust of architecture at the time, categorized by Louis Sullivan, who basically builds skyscrapers, these big, boxy, form over function buildings. Whereas Wright wants things to flow with nature. He wants things to be aesthetically appealing. Much like architecture, some other famous figures of the 1920s you should be familiar with: Charlie Chaplin and his famous mustache and hat. Rudolph Valentino, which you might not be as familiar with, but he was a huge star of the silent film, and I've given you a little clip from one of his films here that I'd like you to explore. And then Babe Ruth. I'm sure everyone's heard of Babe Ruth and the New York Giants, his famous big league slugger hitter. Okay, so we've talked mostly about the general trends of the 1920s and some of the more iconic aspects of it, but we also need to talk about politics. So the election of 1920 elects Warren G. Harding, and as students of Ohio, specifically of Marion, you're probably very familiar with Warren G. Harding. Unfortunately, Harding is probably one of the worst American presidents, but he does run. He's running as the Republican candidate, so the conservative candidate, with Calvin Coolidge as his vice president. He really wins this election because he's advocating what Americans at the time wanted to hear. He's advocating a return to normalcy, quote, a return to what life was like before World War I, a return to isolationism, going back, forgetting all these horrors of war. Unfortunately, the Democratic candidate at the time, James N. Cox, who was also from Ohio, does not see this need and this view of the American public. His running mate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, will eventually become president. James N. Cox does not win this debate, mostly because he's supporting the League of Nations. He's kind of following the ideas of Wilson, who was a Democrat, so it makes sense. But the American public was tired of hearing it and just didn't want to think about this war anymore. Also running was the socialist candidate Eugene V. Debs. He's run several times. He'll continue to run. He's actually running from a jail cell at this time because he was arrested under the Sedition Act in World War I. Surprisingly, even from jail, he gets 6% of the total vote. So the aftermath of World War I. Remember that the War Industries Board had been created in kind of the latter half of the war. It was created to streamline American production, create a better line of communication between wartime industries and the American military and politics, but it didn't really do its jobs very well, and it ultimately was seen as not useful. So it is almost immediately dismantled. The Ish-Cummings Transportation Act of 1920 is passed, and there is an increase in race riots. Race riots really are a result, and sometimes you'll just hear them collectively called the Red Summer. They're a result of increasing patriotism, they're a result of fear of immigration, and the fact that the Great Migration North that had occurred during World War I meant that there were huge African American populations in northern cities that hadn't been there before. And when soldiers return, they want the jobs that a lot of these African Americans and immigrants had taken. So there is violent race riots across northern cities. So Harding's administration as a whole. So as I said, he is associated with several scandals. If you don't mind watching this YouTube video, we'll discuss the Teapot Dome scandal and some others, as well as Harding in more detail. Most of the scandals are actually not by Harding himself. They're by his cabinet, which is why he often gets them called the Poker Cabinet or the Ohio Gang. Usually, he was aware of what was going on, but doesn't really intervene. The most famous of these scandals is the Teapot Dome scandal, which was a bribery, basically, of oil reserves. In 1921, Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall gives away naval oil reserves in exchange for bribes to specific companies. Ultimately, this scandal, as well as others, will lead to an undermining of America's faith in the entire political system. Harding, perhaps because of the stress with these scandals, dies in San Francisco in 1923 while on a speaking tour before ending his term in office. His vice president, that previous governor we had talked about with the Boston police strike, Calvin Coolidge, will assume the presidency. And Calvin Coolidge will not make the mistake of Harding. So some of Harding's economic policies, many of these are things that Coolidge will continue. Again, he's Republican, he's conservative, he's pro-business. He supports, as well as many of his cabinet members, support business in its entirety. The goal of the government is to make business more profitable, and that's the policies they set forth. Andrew Mellon, who's one of his good cabinet members, if you want to put it that way, is responsible for beginning that trickle-down economics theory we had talked about previously, but also for setting higher tariffs. So this has been part of the Republican platform since the 1890s, the idea of protective tariffs, protecting against European goods, protecting your American business from these cheap foreign goods. The Fordham-McCumber tariff of 1922 does exactly that. It raises the tariff to ensure that cheaper European goods don't flood the American market. Unfortunately, Harding will also be allowed to appoint 4 Supreme Court justices. Because he is a conservative president, these Supreme Court justices are all, for the most part, conservative. They're hostile to unions, they're pro-business. And because Supreme Court justices serve for life, they are on the Supreme Court for the next several decades. You'll see that the Supreme Court is increasingly conservative over the next several years. All right, so Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge does, again, follow a lot of Harding's policies. He is the vice president under Harding. But he does start to realize that there is an economic problem facing farmers and agriculture. Depression had hit the agricultural sector early because it had been geared up so much for World War I, and it hadn't been geared back down when we returned to a consumer economy. And it was facing increasing competition from European countries who were recovering after that war. In order to try and protect farming, he will pass higher tariffs. He tries to make sure that there's a way to keep the price of agricultural goods high, so the McNair-Hagen bill. Unfortunately, these policies do not work. You can't pull farming out of this pit that it's in. It's a much bigger problem than the government at the time really realizes. Just kind of raising taxes and buying up surplus will not be the problem, will not be the solution. And farmers will be the first ones hit by the economic depression of the 30s. They're actually hit by it in the mid-1920s. That brings us to the election of 1924. So Calvin Coolidge will run as the Republican candidate. He was kind of the one who takes over after Harding. The Democratic candidate will be John W. Davis. The parties as a whole are split, so even within the party lines, you have those who are for prohibition, those who are against it, those who are for Darwinist ideas, and those who are against Darwinist ideas. You have those who are for immigration, who are liberal, those who are not. And all of these competing views come together in this election. In addition to your traditional Republican and Democratic candidates, you also have the Progressive Party running on the ticket. The bulk of progressives are farmers, and mostly those farmers are in the South and the Midwest, and they're the ones who are going to be voting for that progressive ticket. Unfortunately, farmers don't make up enough of the population. As you see, they only get 13 electoral votes to really make an impact, and their voice isn't really being heard in the government at the time. So obviously, Coolidge will win. You can see by this map, Robert LaFolle gets Wisconsin. It's about it. Coolidge gets the North, as you would expect. Coolidge will base a lot of his policies off of World War I, and he will also reverse some of the policies of World War I. So some of the things that he has to face in his presidency is Muscle Shoals. Muscle Shoals, Alabama was actually a collection of hydroelectric generation stations in Tennessee along the Tennessee River. They were dams. They were kind of state-controlled, state-run. They were built to help the poor in this region, and they were actually extremely effective. Republicans will stop this project. After World War I, they dismantle the project. They say it's too far-reaching. It gives too much power to the government. It's socialistic in that it takes, the collective wealth and hands it out to the workers. But Muscle Shoals, despite it being dismantled by the Republicans during this time period, will come back with the 1930s New Deal policy and will eventually become the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority of the New Deal. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the 1930s. So just a quick memory aid. This is not mine. I took it from online. But the conservatives of the 1920s, politicians in general in the 1920s, wanted higher tariffs. That's a Republican platform since the 1800s. Anti-union, again, they are pro-business, so anything that restricts business or trade is not something they're going to support. Laissez-faire, or hands-off capitalism, and then trickle-down tax policies under Mellon. And this idea of cutting taxes for the wealthy, and then it will trickle down to the masses, so to speak. So some of the foreign policy approaches in the 1920s, of course, a return to isolationism, that Harding platform, return to normalcy. Our decision to keep ourselves isolated, to keep ourselves with our blinders on in terms of what we understood about what was going on in Europe, meant that we kind of shoulder a lot of the blame for World War II. We did not react. We did not help France in trying to protect its borders against Germany. We did not hold on to those disarmament agreements with Germany. And we didn't really keep an eye on what was going on in Europe the way we should have. And of course, under Wilson, we never actually joined the League of Nations. So France had approached us after World War I asking for a security treaty against Germany. We reject it. The decision to reject it meant that there is an arms race that goes on in France, and then there's a subsequent arms race that goes on in Germany, and this will eventually lead to World War II. So some of those attempts at disarmament, some of those attempts at peace after World War I that were obviously not successful were the 5 Powers Treaty, the 4 Powers Treaty, and the 9 Power Treaty. You don't need to know the exact details of these treaties, but they are an attempt at naval disarmament between us and the Far East. Specifically between us, Britain, and Japan, and they have to do with trying to limit the number of ships that each country is allowed to have. Unfortunately, both of these treaties will make it so that Japan actually has naval superiority in the Pacific in comparison to us and Great Britain. Another major concern of the United States after World War I was protection of our trade in China. So again, conservative government, conservative politics were focused on trade. So the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922 basically preserves our previous open door policies that we had established prior to World War I, keeping trade open in China. Previous policies like dollar diplomacy under Taft will lead to violent intervention in Caribbean and Central America. This intervention was in response to revolutions, the rise of dictatorial leaders or coups that we thought was a threat to democracy, a threat to our influence in these countries. We will also have kind of a little spat with Mexico at this time period. Mexico basically tells us that the oil fields will become privatized and that American companies cannot own the oil fields there for a period of time. We will resolve this with the Clark Memorandum, but it shows this increasing animosity that's going on in the world at the time. Right, so after World War I, obviously Germany owes us a lot of money, but not just us. They owe France, they owe Britain, they owe almost all of Europe. And that was part of the Treaty of Versailles, punishing Germany for starting, well, according to the treaty, starting World War I. The US, on the other hand, emerges as a creditor nation, where not only does Germany owe money, but also France and Britain owe us a lot of money from war loans that they had taken out during the war. And because we have a conservative government, because we are protecting business and trade, we had passed a lot of protective tariffs, very high tariffs, that made it so France and Britain could not easily trade goods with the United States. They were kind of barred from that, and they couldn't sell their goods to earn money necessary to repay the debts that they owed to the United States. So instead, they turned on Germany and they kind of squeezed Germany dry to try and get the money from Germany they needed to pay back the United States. The response by Germany was basically to let things go to the extreme. In this picture, you see German children playing with stacks of money, because money in Germany got to the point where it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. If you wanted a loaf of bread, you literally had to take a wheelbarrow of money just to buy that one loaf of bread. And it was useless. They were using it as wallpaper. This meant that even if Germany was paying money back to France and Britain, the money didn't mean anything. It was completely useless. And despite all of these problems, despite this cycle of debt, Coolidge, because he is a conservative Republican president, absolutely refuses to cancel any of these debts. Instead, the proposal or the plan to deal with this economic system was the Dawes Plan of 1924. This plan would reschedule German reparation payments to make it possible for further American private loans to Germany. The entire idea was that US loans would be given to Germany to help Germany repay France and Britain, who in turn would then pay back the United States. So we were giving loans to Germany to get money back from France and Britain. Kind of a convoluted cycle, but that was the plan. Obviously, this doesn't work. US credit does continue to finance European markets until the bubble bursts, and it leads to Black Tuesday and the great markets crash and an entire worldwide depression when this bubble finally bursts. Another response, so a response to this increasing concern about economic woes, increasing tensions, was something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It doesn't actually do much of anything in terms of actual impact because it doesn't have any enforcement powers, but it shows the general trend, this idea that politics will solve all of the problems with the world. What this pact does is it's signed and it's agreed upon between 62 nations and makes war, quote, illegal except in the case of defensive purposes. I'm sure you've noticed the big loophole in this pact. The term defensive purposes was not defined. You know, you didn't have to be fired upon first. It could be a moral defense. It could be a, philosophical reason that you were attacking. There was a huge loophole in the bill in the fact that it didn't define defensive purposes, so it basically voids the entire pact. It's never really used for anything. It does show an attempt to have peace and a recognition by world powers throughout the world that tensions are growing, but not enough investment in peace to really do something. So this is the last thing we'll talk about in this lecture. It's really kind of the end of the 1920s, beginning of that economic 1930s crash. Hoover, I'm sure you know, is associated with Hoovervilles in the 1930s. But he is actually very well liked when he's first elected in 1928. He wins by a huge margin, 444 electoral votes to only 87 for the Democratic candidate at the time. And he is running on a platform of prohibition, rugged individualism, prosperity, whereas the Democratic candidate, Alfred E. Smith, is running on the platform of rural America and the Deep South. He is a quote-unquote, wet son of Irish immigrants. He is generally unliked. Again, this is an era of hyper-patriotism, anti-immigration, and because of that, he just really has no chance in this election. Unfortunately for Hoover, he does not realize that the economic bubble is about to burst, and because of that, one of his campaign slogans, "Poverty will be banished from the nation," is a glaring, ironic contradiction to how his presidency actually goes, because he oversees one of the worst economic crashes ever in American history. So we'll talk more about him in the next lecture, just to kind of introduce here. Lastly, questions to consider. I always put these up here. They tend to show up on midterm or final exams. Hint, hint. If you have trouble answering any of these, if you have questions about any of these, make sure that you shoot me an email. You bring it up at the next class, because these are the main takeaways from this lecture. So that's all that I have. Please enjoy your weekend.